Welcome to this online meeting which Chatham House has been asked to host on a criminal tribunal for aggression in Ukraine. I'm Elizabeth Wilmshurst, a fellow here at Chatham House with the International Law Programme. The meeting is on the record, not under the Chatham House rule. We're honoured to have very distinguished panellists and a huge and distinguished online audience. I want to welcome especially our two participants from Ukraine, Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine Foreign Minister, and Mikhailo Gnatovsky, his advisor and international law professor. The Foreign Minister will be with us just for a short time while he speaks. And a hearty welcome to Gordon Brown, formerly Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and a collegial welcome to two professors of international law, Philippe Sands and Dapo Akande. There was a declaration signed at St. James Palace in London on the 13th of January 1942, quite close to us here at Chatham House. It led eventually to the establishment of the Nuremberg Tribunal, which tried the Nazi war criminals after the Second World War. It's somehow fitting that here in St. James Square, Chatham House should have been asked to host a discussion on another such declaration. The paths to international criminal justice are difficult and winding, but there always needs to be a first step. Before I turn to the panelists, let me just say that questions can be written in the Q&A function. We only have an hour to the meeting, so I shall only be able to take a few questions, unfortunately. I'm going to hand straight over to you, Philippe Sands.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you to Chatham House and to all the staff for making this possible, and to all my colleagues, and especially for people who are coming in from Ukraine and colleagues of Professor Gnatovsky's, our strong sense of solidarity with you. I'm Philippe Sands. I'm Professor of Law at University College London and a barrister at Matrix Chambers. By way of context, to follow on from what Elizabeth has said, modern international law recognizes four international crimes: war crimes dating back to the 19th century, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. The last three, of course, date to 1945 and Nuremberg. The crime of aggression, the waging of an illegal war, was referred to as crimes against peace back then, and it was in fact introduced into Nuremberg by an extraordinary Russian jurist, Aaron Trainin. Today, the International Criminal Court in The Hague has jurisdiction over three crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And this week, in an unprecedented act of international solidarity and outrage, 39 states parties to the ICC statute referred the situation in Ukraine to the ICC prosecutor, Mr. Karim Khan. No such thing has ever happened before. He is now investigating, and he and his team must be given all the support and resources necessary to see through those investigations and the prosecutions which may follow to their end. But there remains one big gap, and it's the crime of aggression. The war that is being waged by Mr. Putin and members of his inner circle is illegal. It was not authorized by the Security Council. It does not amount to the exercise of self-defense, and it is manifestly not for lawful humanitarian purposes. The recourse to war in Ukraine amounts to a crime of aggression, and that is one that gives rise to individual criminal responsibility under international law. It's the only crime which allows those responsible for the totality of the terrible events we are now witnessing to be held to account, to be judged. And that was why early this week, I wrote an article in the Financial Times calling for the gap to be filled, for a special international criminal tribunal to be created, which can hold those responsible for these horrors to be judged. It would be complementary to the vital work of the ICC and to other courts and tribunals, the International Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, both of which are engaged. The inspiration, the same as evoked by Elizabeth Wilmshurst, was January 1942 in the Declaration of St. James, when European governments in exile came together here in London to commit to the prosecution of war criminals in the German occupation of Europe. Back then, it was thought to be pie in the sky, but of course it took off, as decent ideas do, and that effort led to Nuremberg. I'm not starry-eyed about international law. It is just one weapon in the armory available to the international community. But it's become plain to me that sanctions alone will not work and that more is going to be needed. If we're committed to standing up to what is, in my view, a naked, lawless act of aggression, we must leave no stone unturned. And harnessing the idea of the rule of law and the crime of aggression is one more way of doing that. I have to say, I know that part of the world. I wrote about it in my book, East-West Street. My grandfather was born in the extraordinary, wonderful city of Lviv. He left it in 1914 as a different Russian army was on the cusp of occupying his hometown. And for that reason, I feel a particular sense of solidarity with the people of Ukraine. And I support the call by Foreign Minister Kuleba to create a special tribunal for the punishment of the crime of aggression in Ukraine. And I hope that other countries will recognize the significance of the crime of aggression and will support this vital initiative. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Now over to Professor Akande.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And can I also join in solidarity with the people of Ukraine with respect to the situation that we all see on our screens. Philippe has just indicated the importance of the crime of aggression, both in international law in general, but also in relation to the situation that we are witnessing in Ukraine. As Philippe has mentioned, the International Criminal Court is now dealing with the situation in Ukraine. I would like to set out very briefly how this initiative to establish a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine is complementary to the efforts of the ICC. Although the ICC can in principle deal with the crime of aggression, it cannot at present do so with respect to the aggression against Ukraine. This is for two reasons. The first is that the ICC cannot deal with aggression committed by states that are not party to the statute of the ICC. And Russia is not a party to that statute. The second reason that the ICC cannot deal with at present with the crime of aggression against Ukraine is that the ICC could deal with the crime of aggression if a situation regarding aggression was referred to that court by the United Nations Security Council. But as Russia is a permanent member of that Security Council, it would veto any attempts to refer the situation to the ICC. So while the ICC has jurisdiction over the Ukraine situation, it will be focusing its investigation on the allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the context of this armed conflict. That focus will relate to specific acts in the conduct of hostilities which amount to violations of the law of armed conflict. I'm sure the ICC will also focus on any widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population in Ukraine. What will be left unaddressed, though, is how we got into this situation in the first place, the decision to wage an aggressive war. The purpose of this tribunal, which we are talking about today, is essentially to close that gap. So while this tribunal and the ICC will be looking at the same situation, they will be covering different crimes. One, the tribunal we're discussing, will focus on the bigger picture, which remains illegal irrespective of how the war is conducted. The other, the ICC, will focus on the way in which the war is actually waged. And so the two things that they're looking at will fit together nicely. And our expectation is that these tribunals will work together. It's impressive to see the determination of the people of Ukraine, and also to see the determination of the government to ensure that accountability exists for the crimes that have been committed in this situation. Thank you very much, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Dapo. And may I just mention for those who haven't noticed that the declaration on the tribunal can now be found, a link can now be found on your screen. Mr. Brown, can I turn over to you?
It's a privilege to be online at Chatham House, to follow such distinguished lawyers, Philip Sands, Dapo Akande, and soon to hear Mykola Nanovsky. And can I start by saying I'm in awe of the bravery shown by him and the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Dmytro Kuleba, and his government. Courage, Winston Churchill once said, is the greatest quality of all, because upon it all else depends. And I want also to acknowledge the selfless courage of the people of Ukraine. President Putin's army may capture Ukrainian territory and people's homes, but he will never capture Ukrainian hearts and minds. Already far too many lives have been destroyed, but Ukraine's resolve is indestructible. Hearts are being broken every hour of the day, but the unity of Ukraine is unbreakable. But the people of Ukraine now need us to confront the enormity of the challenge that President Putin's actions pose to them and the very existence of the post-1990 international order. He has sought to overturn the rule of law by the use of force. He seeks to replace the principle of self-determination with a new form of imperialism based on a warped reading of history. In his attempt to redraw the map of Europe, he seeks to redivide East and West. If we were to acquiesce in any way, none of us could ever take freedom for granted ever again, or be sure that democracy or peace would triumph over totalitarianism. For all these reasons, and because of the scale of the suffering now imposed on the people of Ukraine, I believe that most people would agree that this act of aggression by Russia, deplored in the strongest terms this week by the UN General Assembly, cannot go uninvestigated, unprosecuted, and unpunished. But there is, as we have heard, a serious gap in international law. Since Russia is not a party to the statute of the International Criminal Court, then this crime of aggression cannot, as things stand, be investigated by the prosecutor. So even as we encourage Karim Khan QC in the International Criminal Court to investigate crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes that may include the targeting of civilians, the use of vacuum bombs, and the threat of nuclear terror, we must also address Russia's responsibility for aggression, crimes against peace, starting and continuing the war with no ceasefire and without safe passage on humanitarian grounds. Doing so will complement the work of the European Court of Human Rights in addressing violations of human rights and the request by Ukraine for the International Court of Justice to intervene on its behalf. So I'm here today to support the case my legal friends have so eloquently set out, and the documentation for which I have sent to governments across Europe. But most of all, I'm here to support the government of Ukraine, which is today calling on the international community to create a special tribunal to investigate the specific crime of aggression, one for which Mr. Putin and his closest military, political, intelligence, and financial collaborators may be found to be individually liable, having waged a war that has no conceivable legal justification, as it is not in self-defense and is contrary to the Charter of the United Nations. The special tribunal should be constituted on the same principles that guided what we have heard today, the Allied powers in 1942, when from in London, they insisted in their statement, punishment for war crimes, that I quote, war crimes should not be left unpunished. It was a statement that led, as we've heard, to the International Military Tribunal, which led to the trials at Nuremberg. A tribunal was necessary, as the 1942 declaration said, to satisfy the sense of justice of the civilized world. They wanted, and I quote again, to secure the punishment through the channel of organized justice of those guilty or responsible for these crimes. The Special Tribunal for the punishment of the crime of aggression against Ukraine can be set up with speed, and I want to call on all the countries of Europe to agree to grant jurisdiction to the dedicated tribunal, giving it the power to investigate the principal perpetrators of the crime of aggression and all those who are complicit in its commission, including those who provided finance. Now, the cost of war is to be counted not only in tanks destroyed, missiles fired, and bullets discharged, but in the desperate cry of wounded children, the anguish of bereaved mothers and fathers, and the tears and suffering of the innocent. We owe it to the people of Ukraine to act now and show them that never again will the crime of aggression go unpunished. We owe it to the coming generation to prevent the unmooring of the international system from its familiar anchors, diplomacy, the rule of law, and the willingness to work together through international institutions. And the need is urgent. As we speak, Russia are surrounding Ukraine's cities, tightening their grip, and by their bombing, threatening to create a desert and call it peace. Yes, sadly, buildings are being razed to the ground, but not the spirit of the Ukrainian people. And by acting in solidarity with them, we will signal our resolve that lawless aggression will not be tolerated anywhere on European soil or elsewhere, and that by leaving no stone unturned and bringing to an end this evil, we ensure that those who've unleashed the horrors are subject to personal accountability under the criminal law. All those hoping for peace, not only in Ukraine, but across Europe, cry out for justice. And no one is better able to put the case for his people and for the peace of the world than the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, the distinguished and respected Dmytro Kuleba.
Thank you so much and welcome, Foreign Minister. We look forward very much to hearing your remarks now.
Yes, I'm sorry I may not look like a foreign minister, but this is me, Dmytro Kuleba. I'm in Ukraine, and I would like to thank Chatham House for hosting this meeting. My special thanks go to Prime Minister Brown, Professor Sands, and Dapo Akande for taking the leadership to organize this event and for coming up with this initiative. It's hard to speak, but 80 years ago, representatives of 9 countries met, 9 nations met in London to set up a legal framework for prosecution of war criminals during the Second World War. And we all know that led to the establishment of a precedent in international law that basically defined the future development of international criminal law. Now, 8 years ago, Russia launched an aggression against Ukraine, occupying Crimea, some parts of our territory in eastern Ukraine. And 8 full days ago, Russia, in a rather barbarian way, launched another wave of aggression against Ukraine. It's a full-fledged aggression, masks off. And the question is now how the international community will handle it. We welcome the initiative of the International Criminal Court to investigate crimes which fall in its jurisdiction, namely war crimes and crimes against humanity. The prosecutor of International Criminal Court has also demonstrated leadership in this effort, and Ukraine will cooperate fully with ICC while not being a full party to the conflict, to the Rome Statute, but we recognize jurisdiction on crimes, on war crimes and crimes against humanity since 2014. And so the moment I learned about the initiative to set up a tribunal, a multinational tribunal, to investigate the crime of aggression against Ukraine, I immediately said yes. And this yes comes from me not only as a person, but also as a representative of the government of Ukraine. We appreciate the initiative. We are looking forward to working actively on it, and also to engage with those countries who are willing to take part in this important undertaking. The aim of this initiative is not to replace International Criminal Court or any other jurisdictional bodies, but to fill the gap that exists in international law and to use the experience of international community and international law for the benefit of the people and of the world order based on international law. When bombs fall on your cities, when soldiers rape women in the occupied cities, and we have numerous cases, unfortunately, when Russian soldiers rape women in the Ukrainian cities, it's difficult, of course, to speak about the efficiency of the international law. But this is the only tool of civilization that is available to us to make sure that in the end, eventually, all those who made this war possible will be brought to justice. And the Russian Federation as a country that committed an act of aggression will also be held accountable for its deeds. We are using all tools available, including ICJ. You may have heard about our application on the Convention on Genocide, the European Court of Human Rights, our application to ICC, and I appreciate the referral of the case by 39 countries who are ready to support Ukraine in this. But really, we need to fill the gap on the crime of aggression. And therefore, I would like to support the declaration and the statement calling for the setup of the special tribunal for the punishment of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. The recent UN General Assembly resolution named aggression against Ukraine was supported by 141 countries, which is unprecedented in itself, and it gives us the political ground to move forward with this initiative. So on behalf of the government of Ukraine, once again, we are ready to move on. We are ready to work with anyone who is willing to bring Russia to an account. And I call on all of you who participate in this meeting to contribute to the establishment of this tribunal. And I also call on all media who follow this online meeting to spread the truth about Russia's crimes against Ukraine and to advocate the establishment of such a tribunal. Thank you very much. I will have to switch off and continue my travel, but I appreciate that all of you stand by Ukraine. We are fighting against the enemy who is much stronger than us, but the international law is on our side, and hopefully it will help us. It will make its own contribution to help us prevail. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Minister. Our hearts go with you. We're honored to have you speak here today. I'm going to turn now to Professor Dmytro for a few words, and then we'll go to questions. Professor, could you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wilmshurst. And first of all, let me say that I'm extremely touched by this unprecedented show of solidarity from the international legal community, from international community in general, and from each and every of the colleagues who have participated in putting together this declaration and statement. Your support is felt, your support is very much needed, and it's only possible to achieve anything if we work together. And of course, I can fully agree with the previous points, especially points made by all the speakers today, each and every one again, and of course my foreign minister. Ukraine has consistently demonstrated that it believes in international law, that it believes in international justice, and it will do everything it can for justice to prevail, even under the circumstances that, as Minister Kuleba has just mentioned, create a lot of frustration against concerning international law and its efficiency. Ukraine has never hesitated to submit itself to jurisdiction of international courts and tribunals, and this has been consistent with the International Court of Justice, and also with giving, despite the constitutional difficulties that we had with our constitutional court, giving consent to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Ukraine, in the current situation, Ukraine clearly wants that the perpetrators be punished. And Ukraine believes that this is the moment when we have to move forward also in developing international law, because the current architecture is very much advanced as compared to the situation, to the pre-Second World War II situation, but still the gap about which the colleagues have spoken, namely the absence of an efficient mechanism to prosecute the mother of crimes, the crime of international, co-international crimes, the crime of aggression is still missing. The crime of aggression is criminalized in Ukraine's criminal code, by the way, in Russia's criminal code as well. But certainly the creation of a special tribunal or indeed international involvement is very much desired, given the scale of the crime, given the fact that this crime attacks the very foundations of international law, of international order based on international law. And indeed, there's not, I'm firmly convinced that there's not a single state in the world which is untouched by the current situation, by the aggressive war waged by Putin's Russia against Ukraine. To add perhaps one more point, or perhaps two more points to what has been said. First, I think the creation of such a tribunal should also send a strong signal to those individuals who think that they might still create some profits, some benefits by aiding or abetting the commission of this crime in any way. So I think the large support for the declaration should send them a signal that they might also face criminal responsibility for this kind of action. And the second point I wanted to make is that, in fact, unfortunately, we are dealing with the current dramatic, tragic situation in my country because, to a significant degree, because in 2014, when Russia attacked Ukraine and seized parts of its territory, the international community has not been able to provide a strong response, a response which would be strong enough to deter any further action by the aggressor, to hold the aggressor to account. So to summarize, let me say that we are, as Ukrainian international lawyers and as Ukraine as a country, we are fully committed to working further in the direction of developing international justice, of cooperating with any arrangements that will be of assistance in bringing the perpetrators to account. I thank you once again very much, Prime Minister Brown, Professor Sands, Professor Akandi, Professor Wilmshurst, and everyone who has worked on this. And let's continue doing this. And I call on everyone to join these efforts. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mykola. Now we're able to turn to questions, and I'm really very grateful to the panelists for keeping their remarks short so that we have plenty of time for the many questions. I'm having to group the questions, and I'd like to ask a group of questions which really are dealing with the same question. How realistic is it that we will ever get President Putin to a tribunal? I'd really like to pass that one to you, Mr. Brown, if I may. Is this a realistic thing that we're talking about?
I think it is a realistic option. We have been in contact already with the government of the United Kingdom, the government of France, the government of the Netherlands, the European Union, the government of Sweden, the government of some of the Baltic states. And they are now looking at this, and I hope they are looking at it with an eye to making a decision to support this, but they're certainly looking at this with a great deal of care and resilience in the way that they are wanting to find ways to deal with this problem. I want to call in Professor Sands because he has done some of this talking with other countries. I think they know that there is this gap in international law and that this is the way to fill it. I think there are other moves taking place at the United Nations that we should recognize that may also complement this. We've always insisted that this is complementary to what the ICC is proposing to do and how 39 countries are supporting the ICC in its actions. And I do think we've got to get to the heart of the issue, that this is an act of aggression, it's a crime against peace, and you have to investigate it and you have to hold those responsible. So we are hoping that the governments across Europe initially will take this up. And I'm going to ask Professor Sands to add to this because he has been in talks with other governments and I've been in talks with some of them.
Thank you. And before I pass that over to you, Philippe, Gordon Brown mentioned the UN dimension, and some of the questions concern the basis on which a tribunal could be established. Isn't this really a matter for the United Nations? Of course, not the Security Council, but the General Assembly. Could you take those up together?
Philip, would you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, just on this last point, I mean, one of the things we've learned since the horrors of Yugoslavia and Rwanda, where there is the political will, it is possible to create tribunals. It's as simple as that. It's not that there's a rule of international law against it, or you can't do this or the other. It's all about political will. If states want to do it, it can and will happen. And the talk within the UN context has been of creating a tribunal on the basis of an agreement, a treaty between the United Nations and Ukraine. And there is precedent for that in recent years. So yes, it is possible to do it. It depends on political will. Will it happen? I can't predict. One thing I've been struck by is I've now talked directly or indirectly to probably more than a dozen governments, and there is a very close reflection going on. There are obviously serious questions to address on how one would do this. It's something that perhaps DAPO can address in due course. I think we felt at this stage with Professor Gnatowski and the foreign minister, we should deal with the issue of principle. Do we want such a thing? And our answer to that is yes. If we want it, then it could be done. I come to Gordon's passing on of the question, could one ever imagine Mr. Putin in the dock? Who knows? When Charles de Gaulle and others met in London in January 1942, it must have been unimaginable that ever Nazi leaders like Hermann Goering and others would find themselves in the dock. And yet 3 years later, that is what happened. Equally, when Herschel Lauterpacht coined the legal term crimes against humanity, when Raphael Lemkin invented the word genocide in 44 and 45, they had no idea that these terms would take off. So I think our responsibility is to marshal the ideas, show how it is to be done, and express the hope that it is then for governments to take forward those ideas. But law tells you and experience tells you that the impossible sometimes is capable of happening. In 1945, the imminence of the creation of the Nuremberg Tribunal was the basis for negotiations with some very senior people around Adolf Hitler, which caused them to cut deals and to avoid prosecution themselves. And I think one of the ideas would be that those in the inner circle might at some point say to themselves, do I really want to be associated with this? Am I willing to break ranks? And am I willing to assist in these investigations? Who knows, but it's not impossible.
Thank you very much. We have had one question. I don't know who to address it to. It's this: if we create a tribunal for this instance of aggression in Ukraine, what about all of the other instances of violations of international law, violations of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter on the use of force? Does this really support the international rule of law if we're just doing this for one? I wonder what the answer to that is, and I wonder who I'm going to address that to. Dapo, you look as if you're ready for this one.
No, that's a good question. And questions of selectivity in international law, and in particular in international criminal law, have been posed. But as you said, Elizabeth, when you gave your opening remarks, you have to start with some first steps to get there. And we have had steps in relation to the crime of aggression. Of course, we had the steps at Nuremberg in 1945 and in Tokyo as well in 1945. Then we've had some steps in relation to the International Criminal Court. And we've made some progress in relation to the International Criminal Court with regard to the crime of aggression. But for the reasons that we've given, the court doesn't have jurisdiction in this case. At least at present, it doesn't. And so because the court doesn't have, the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression in this particular instance, do we say, well, we do nothing? Or do we pursue other means that are legally available to us? And we're saying we should pursue other means that are legally available to us. You know, one could have looked just 30 years ago in relation to the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. One could have said, well, why are we setting up criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda? Are those the only places where international crimes have been committed? But now we look 30 years on, not only have we seen international criminal tribunals for other countries, we now have the International Criminal Court. So just because we can't do everything does not mean that we shouldn't do anything. That would be my response.
Thank you. These questions have come in thick and fast. Here's one for Professor Gnatowski. Ukraine has the crime of aggression in its national law. Is there a possibility here of using universal jurisdiction in the national courts? I'm sorry even to ask this question because it depends so much on future circumstances.
Indeed, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this question. First of all, the exercise of in general, of course, and this is a professor of international law speaking rather than a Ukrainian. In general, the exercise of universal jurisdiction for the crime of aggression is a more controversial issue as compared to the exercise of universal jurisdiction for, let's say, genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes. But in principle, of course, there is nothing that prevents Ukraine from exercising the jurisdiction of its national courts, because here it's not even universal. You know, there's a clear jurisdictional link here. However, the national efforts, of course, again, you rightly said, Elizabeth, that it all depends on how things go, and we're certainly determined to defend Ukraine and to ensure that it survives this terrible aggression. But the scale of the crime is such that I think, in the interest of the international community, it calls for international action. That's why it would be advisable if states vest the newly established tribunal with the jurisdiction they have under national law for the crime of aggression, and also that tribunal has the jurisdiction that emanates from general international law, because this, I would say that this aggression, of course, it is directed against Ukraine, but everyone's a victim. Russian people are a victim of this aggression as well. There's so many people now in Russia who are opposing this aggression wholeheartedly, and who will be suffering innocently in a way, because this decision was taken by the person who is the president of the country for many years, and also they will suffer from restrictions of human rights and fundamental freedoms that they used to enjoy in Russia. So I think it's clearly an international matter, and there must be a solution based on the international law that we have now. Again, when we speak about the involvement of the International Criminal Court, the substantive law is there. It's the procedural provisions of the Kampala Compromise that prevent the International Criminal Court from exercising its jurisdiction. And it's clear that we can't just remain silent and inactive in the face of this situation. Thank you very much again for giving me the floor.
Thank you very much. I want to ask one or two technical legal questions now, although these may be for the future. It's been asked about the immunity of heads of state. Isn't Putin immune from any such jurisdiction of any such a tribunal? Dapo Akande.
So as a matter of general international law, serving heads of states have immunity, certainly from national criminal jurisdiction. And then there are questions about whether they also have immunity if they are sought to be prosecuted by an international tribunal. There's been there's a range of views on that question. So on whether or not they have immunity before international tribunals. The International Criminal Court gave a decision a couple of years ago with respect to the Sudanese president, the then Sudanese president, Omar al-Bashir, in which the International Criminal Court, who was facing a charge of genocide, by the way, at the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court held that though he was then a serving head of state, he was not immune under customary international law because those were proceedings before an international tribunal. Now that ruling by the ICC was one which was controversial, but that's what they held, and they relied on an earlier judgment which had been given in a case involving Charles Taylor, who was then the head of state of Liberia, who was sought by the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which is also an international tribunal. So that's one view. Not everyone accepts that view, but actually in this case, there's another issue which arises, which is that this is not just a case, it would be an international criminal tribunal, but it's not just a case of an international criminal tribunal. This is a case where the government of Ukraine would be delegating the national jurisdiction that it has to prosecute the crime of aggression that occurs on its territory and against it to this international tribunal. And as a matter of international law, looking at it more broadly, Ukraine obviously has the right of self-defense, which it is exercising in this circumstance. It has the right to act in self-help. It can use force, and it is using force to defend itself. And it would seem to me to be far-fetched to say, yes, Ukraine can do that. Yes, it can use force. If necessary, even it can use force, a state acting in self-defense on the territory of the aggressor state. If necessary, it could even use force to change the government of the aggressor state. But the one thing it cannot do is actually it cannot prosecute the head of state. That would seem to me to be quite far-fetched an answer to give in relation to a state that is acting in the exercise of its right of self-defense and its ability to take self-help measures to defend itself.
Dapo, thank you for mentioning that in your view, this is a question of Ukraine delegating its own jurisdiction, because we have had some questions about the wording in the declaration which talks about granting jurisdiction arising under national criminal codes and general international law. And I think that is the nub of many questions, certainly from the legal community. What is the basis of the jurisdiction? But I suppose that will depend as well on whether this is set up by an agreement between the UN General Assembly or the Secretary General and Ukraine, or in some other way. I would like to pass on to a question which pervades many of those on the web. What are the next steps? How many states, how many governments is it necessary to sign up? Who is going to take this forward? Is this going to be sent to the UN? I know we have a UN legal advisor listening in. Philippe.
A modest question, Elizabeth. I mentioned earlier, it really all turns on political will. One thing that has struck me over the course of the week, when I first drafted an article for the FT, it didn't occur to me there would be this level of interest generated in just 2 or 3 days. So the idea seems to have struck a chord. Again, without revealing too much, it is plain that a number of countries are now looking at this initiative very seriously. And it has gone to the highest levels in some very significant countries and supporters of Ukraine. And it could be done in a number of different ways. It all turns on political will. As I said earlier, if Ukraine and other states want to do this, it will happen. The timescale according to which it happens, we don't know. It may be you don't need any other states to support it. It may be there can be an agreement between Ukraine and the United Nations, and that is sufficient to get it up and running. Or it may be you do it in a different way. You have it as a European initiative with a small number of core European states coming together with Ukraine, turning the idea into some sort of treaty basis. And of course, there are lots of modality questions about where you locate it, what powers you give to it, how you fund it, and so on and so forth. And again, we're not starry-eyed. We realize those are all questions that will have to be addressed. My own sense is that what's important now is that a relatively tight, discrete group of countries hopefully will come together and say, you know what, we think this is an idea worth exploring. We're going to sit down with Professor Dmytro and the foreign minister, and we're going to work out the elements of a legal basis for doing this. And that core idea can, I think, pretty quickly be taken up. So again, we know from everything that has happened since the events of the 1990s, Dapo mentioned Yugoslavia and Rwanda. You know, people have forgotten that after Nuremberg and Tokyo, there were no international tribunals created. And then the horrors of 93 and 94 in those two countries took place. And we are pretty creative, and the law is pretty flexible in providing mechanisms. And very soon we created a range of different mechanisms. Dapo mentioned the issue of immunity in the context of the ICC. I was appointed in the Special Court for Sierra Leone by the Appeals Chamber as an amicus to file ideas with my colleague Alison MacDonald on immunity. And in fact, it was us with another colleague, Diane Orentlicker, who came up with the ways of getting around the immunity issue in relation to Charles Taylor. So international law is there and available. It's all about political will. My hope is that there will be 5 or 6 countries that will now say, let's run with this. And it may or may not include some of the bigger countries like the UK and like France. My own hope is that they are on board. They've been playing a leadership role. They've been playing a very positive role. They both have commitments to the rule of law internationally, but they can provide important input and support, and that it runs in that particular way. But I think the key point was, it was very moving listening to the foreign minister, I have to say. You heard his integrity, you heard his authenticity, you heard his authority and his gravity of purpose. This is a serious country with a serious foreign minister, with serious lawyers available to it. Let us support Ukraine in taking this idea forward. It will have ideas on how to do it on the basis of this. Let us please support Ukraine.
Gordon Brown, could I ask you to add?
You asked about the next steps, and Philip has suggested some of them. Remember, first of all, this is a request now from Ukraine. This is not just a group of lawyers or politicians getting together. Ukraine has asked the international community to consider a tribunal for the crime of aggression. Secondly, we know that 39 countries have been in touch with the International Criminal Court and are concerned about the legality and about the willingness of the international community to take action. And some of these countries are now looking at this crime of aggression and whether a tribunal should be set up. You asked what people should do to sign and support the declaration, which I think is now on your website. Social media, a number of campaigns have been started asking and drawing attention to the need for legal action against the Russian government. Equally, at the same time, continue to press your own governments for them to give a considered view on this proposal so that there is a chance of moving it forward. And I'm not just talking about the Western European states, because this has started as a European initiative. It could go wider, but also the Eastern European states. And please remember that what is happening even now is something which is an offense that has got to be recognized and dealt with. I am surprised that this morning, now that the Russian government have taken over a second nuclear power station in Ukraine and now are in control of it, they have not made a statement that they will not allow that nuclear station to be used to endanger and to threaten human life. And it is these very instances of Russia's failure to respond to the pleas of the international community that make us determined that we will step up our campaign to make sure that Russia is brought to justice for what is a crime of aggression, but of course could, and I support the International Criminal Court's actions, be in other areas too. So there are many things that people listening to this broadcast today can do. And in support of what Professor Sands says, let us try to persuade some of the countries who already know of this initiative and already have the declaration in their hands that they should come together to form this tribunal.
Thank you very much. And that does answer another question, which is what can participants in this meeting do? There are some questions about whether establishment of a criminal tribunal is the best means of providing some sort of deterrence for what is going on at the moment. And some have pointed to the human rights possibility of human rights commissions of inquiry, whether that's not a better thing. Professor Gnatovsky, do you have any view on that?
Yes, thank you very much for addressing this to me. I know that the UN Human Rights Council has just voted on the creation of an international commission of inquiry for Ukraine, and this is certainly to be welcomed. And again, these are not mutually exclusive ways. On the contrary, they are mutually complementary, and this would further strengthen the available pathways to seeking justice in this situation. But of course, I mean, no one entertains any illusions here. I'm sure that creating tribunals alone is a sufficient deterrent for anything. But I'd rather say that this is a necessary step. Ukraine has, well, due to the political and military circumstances, Ukraine has to defend itself on its own, with support, of course, of a huge number of states, but it's fighting essentially on its own. But at least in the legal and political dimensions, as well as in the economic dimensions, with all the sanctions and so on, I think there should be, quoting Mr. Brown, and no stone should be unturned, and every possibility should be used. So I think that we have to be very realistic, but we should also understand that just I think like the Allied powers in 1942 understood that they wouldn't stop Hitler, but by just signing a declaration saying that war criminals will be held responsible. But this is something that has to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. As we're drawing to a close, I note that one participant says international law is a paper tiger. So I suppose that the creation of such a tribunal will prove, or hope to prove, or go some way to proving that it's not. I wonder if any panelist wants to add a few closing words.
Elizabeth, if I can just maybe as one final thought, because a number of people have raised this question. They've suggested that somehow the boat has been missed, the crime of aggression occurred with the initial decision to go to war. That is not the case. This is a continuing crime. Every attack on every individual house, every attack on every nuclear power plant, every attack on every individual Ukrainian citizen or other person, and we've read with horror the students from Senegal, from India, who find themselves caught up in this terrible situation. Every attack is part of the crime of aggression. It is a continuing crime, and it will continue until this comes to an end. That is how Nuremberg proceeded. Everything from September the 1st, 39, until May the 1st, 1945, May the 9th, 1945, was within the jurisdiction of that tribunal on crimes against peace, as it was called back then. So this is not a problem that is going to go away. This is a continuing horror. And my own hope is that the law has, I listened to what Mykola had to say, we're not starry-eyed about international law, but it wasn't a paper tiger for Mr. Milosevic or for Mr. Karadzic. We don't know where this will go. It's a continuing set of crimes. The do-nothing option for me is not the answer.
Thank you very much indeed. Those are good closing words. I want to thank all panelists and of course the Foreign Minister, who is no longer with us. And I do want to put in a word for the team at Chatham House. We were asked to host this meeting the day before yesterday, and the efforts that went into doing it, I am beyond admiration. I'd like to mention particularly Anna Morgan. Thank you. Let's all follow this space, do what has been said that we can do, And we're closing the meeting now.